There are towns in America that vanished because of fire, others because of famine, war, or economic collapse. But only a few disappeared beneath something as vast, as silent, and as unstoppable as water. This is the story of St. Thomas, Nevada, a town that didn't burn, didn't crumble, didn't fade. It drowned. St. Thomas was once a thriving Mormon settlement, built in the heat of the Mojave Desert long before Las Vegas was anything more than a dusty trading post. Families grew crops, raised children, built homes, and carved out a life in one of the harshest climates in the country. And then, in the 1930s, the United States government made a decision that would change everything. A massive dam, the Hoover Dam, would be constructed along the Colorado River. It would bring energy, stability, and control to a region long plagued by unpredictable flooding. But the rising waters of the new reservoir, Lake Mead, would swallow entire valleys, including the town of St. Thomas. People were paid to leave. Homes were abandoned. Schools were emptied. The post office closed. Families walked away from orchards their ancestors planted. And slowly, inch by inch, the water rose. By 1938, St. Thomas was gone, buried beneath the deep, still waters of Lake Mead, a town erased by progress. But this story doesn't end underwater, because decades later, when drought began to pull the lake back toward the riverbed, St. Thomas returned. Like an archaeological whisper, the town rose from the water. Foundations, walls, door frames, and memories resurfacing in the harsh Nevada sun. Not restored, not rebuilt, but revealed, and the ghosts of the past were suddenly visible again. This is the story of the town that drowned and came back. Long before the floodwaters rose, St. Thomas was a place built on hope and defiance. In 1865, a group of Mormon settlers traveled deep into the unforgiving Mojave Desert, searching for fertile land and a place where their community could grow in peace. They found it along the muddy banks of the Muddy River, a ribbon of water that supported crops, livestock, and human life in a region where summer heat routinely climbed above 110 degrees. They named their settlement St. Thomas. At first glance, it seemed impossible that anything could thrive here. The desert was brutal. The soil was stubborn. Days were blistering, nights were cold, and the nearest major city was nothing more than a distant rumor. But the people who settled St. Thomas were not ordinary pioneers. They were determined, organized, and deeply committed to building something that would last. They planted fields of alfalfa, cotton, wheat, and corn. They dug irrigation canals by hand. They built homes from adobe and timber hauled across miles of open land. Slowly, methodically, St. Thomas grew into a genuine community. By the late 1800s, the town had a hotel, a general store, a schoolhouse, a blacksmith, a church, and a busy main street where travelers stopped on their way to California. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't wealthy, but it was alive, a small oasis in the vast desert. Families raised children here. Farmers worked the land from sunrise to sunset. Merchants traded goods. Life moved with the seasons, predictable and steady. But beneath this quiet existence, a storm was forming, a decision far beyond the control of the people who lived here. A decision involving engineers, politicians, and a river that refused to behave. The Colorado River was a lifeline for the entire Southwest, and a problem. It flooded violently some years, destroying farms. It shrank in others, leaving communities desperate. America needed a solution. A dam. A massive dam. One large enough to tame the river forever. The people of St. Thomas didn't know it yet, but the fate of their town had already been written in the blueprints of a project so big it would reshape the West. And when construction began, the clocks started ticking. The water that would eventually erase St. Thomas was coming. Not in a wave, not in a surge, but slowly, relentlessly, and permanently. How Hoover Dam doomed the town. The decision that changed everything. As St. Thomas quietly carried on with its simple desert life, a monumental plan was taking shape hundreds of miles up the Colorado River. a plan that would bring electricity, stability, and growth to the entire American Southwest. That plan was the Hoover Dam. In the early 1900s, engineers and officials from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation studied the unpredictable Colorado River with growing urgency. For decades, it had devastated farmlands with massive floods, then shrunk so low that crops died and communities went dry. The Southwest needed control, not just of water, but of its future. The solution would be one of the largest engineering projects in American history. A dam so enormous, it would create one of the biggest reservoirs on Earth. A reservoir that would eventually be named Lake Mead. The people of St. Thomas heard rumors, but rumors were easy to dismiss. After all, how could a quiet farming town in the desert possibly be affected by a dam built so far away? Then the surveyors arrived. They measured elevation, marked valley lines, mapped the water's future, and eventually, the truth reached the community. If the Hoover Dam was built, St. Thomas would be underwater. Not partly underwater, not seasonally underwater, completely underwater. The entire valley, farms, homes, orchards, the schoolhouse, the church, everything would vanish beneath the rising waters of Lake Mead. The government informed the townspeople that their land would be purchased, their homes appraised, and their lives uprooted. Some resisted, some cried, some packed immediately, but all of them understood one thing. There was no stopping what was coming. The dam was bigger than any of them, bigger than their town, bigger than their history. By the 1930s, as construction of the Hoover Dam pushed forward, St. Thomas entered a strange twilight, a place destined to die, yet still alive. Families continued to farm even as they received buyout papers. Children played in schoolyards that would soon be beneath 60 feet of water. Merchants sold goods in shops, knowing the doors would someday never open again. Imagine living with the knowledge that your home has an expiration date, that every sunrise brings you one day closer to losing not just where you live, but the land your ancestors built from nothing. And then the water began to rise. Not suddenly, but slowly, almost politely, inching its way up the valley. The Colorado River filled the basin of Lake Mead like a giant bowl, swallowing fields, fences, and roads. Year by year, the water crept closer. Residents watched the edges of the lake advance toward their front porches, watched trees disappear, watched livestock paths vanish under the growing reservoir. Some left early, unwilling to wait for the inevitable. Others stayed until the last possible moment. But they all knew what was coming. A quiet drowning. The final days, when St. Thomas slipped beneath the water. As the waters of the new Lake Mead crept closer to St. Thomas, the town entered its last and most heartbreaking chapter. What had once been a thriving desert community was now the place suspended between life and erasure. The schoolhouse closed first. Teachers erased their final lessons from chalkboards, knowing the next rainstorm might carry those words into a rising lake. Desks were stacked, doors locked, windows boarded. Not to protect the building, but simply because it felt right to leave it in order. Next came the general stores, the post office, and the small businesses that had served the community for decades. Shops that once buzzed with travelers and farmers now stood silent, their shelves emptied or abandoned in haste. Families packed what they could. Trunks, tools, photographs, quilts, books, heirlooms. Some took the doors off their homes, planning to reuse the wood elsewhere. Others left everything behind, overwhelmed by the weight of leaving. One by one, wagons rolled out of the valley. One by one, houses emptied. Some residents stayed behind long after their neighbors had gone. They harvested their final crops, fed their animals, and walked the familiar paths that would soon be hidden beneath the shimmering surface of a man-made lake. And then there was the last resident, a man named Hugh Lord, a farmer who refused to leave until the water physically forced him out. He stayed long after everyone else, long after the church stood half-drowned, long after the main street was swallowed. He watched the water rise foot by foot, swallowing the past. Finally, in 1938, with lake water lapping at the edges of his home, he climbed onto his roof, set fire to the building, and rowed away in a small boat. As flames rose behind him, The last house in St. Thomas burned. Moments later, the lake consumed the ashes. With that, the town was gone. Beneath 60 feet of water lay everything that once defined St. Thomas. Homes, fences, orchards, wells, the blacksmith shop, foundations of stores, the schoolhouse, the church. A whole community sealed in silence beneath a desert reservoir. For decades, no one saw St. Thomas again. Only fishermen, unaware of the town below, occasionally crossed the water where Main Street once stood. St. Thomas had become a memory, and then even that began to fade. But the desert remembers. And water, even a lake as vast as Mead, cannot hide everything forever. And so, decades later, as drought tightened its grip on the southwest and Lake Mead began to recede, St. Thomas came back, not reborn, not rebuilt, but revealed. The reappearance, when the town rose from the water. Decades after St. Thomas disappeared beneath the rising waters of Lake Mead, the Southwest entered one of the harshest drought cycles in modern history. As rainfall declined and temperatures rose, the great reservoir began to shrink. Year after year, Lake Mead's shoreline receded, revealing long-forgotten canyons, riverbeds, and eventually, something no one expected to see again. The first hints of St. Thomas emerged quietly. A roofline here, a fence post there, the top of a foundation rising above the water like a whisper from the past. As the lake continued its retreat, more of the town resurfaced. Footpaths appeared where fish had once swum. Sun-bleached timbers broke through the desert floor. Brick walls, stubborn and weathered, stood upright after decades underwater. And then, slowly, the entire town revealed itself. Main Street returned, a dusty spine running through the ruins. Foundations outlined the shape of homes long gone. The remnants of the school, the church, the blacksmith, and dozens of houses stood like skeletons of a life abruptly interrupted. It felt surreal, like watching a memory reassemble itself piece by piece. But the strangest part wasn't the way St. Thomas looked. It was the way it felt. Visitors described an eerie stillness, a silence even deeper than the desert around it, as if the town remembered the moment the water took it, as if the ground itself held the echo of footsteps that no longer existed. Park rangers noted something else. Despite being underwater for decades, many structures remained remarkably intact. Adobe walls, once submerged, hardened under the sun. Old wells stood exactly where they had been dug generations earlier. Even the paths between homes remained visible, like scars on the earth. St. Thomas hadn't returned as a ruin. It had returned as a map of memory, a layout of a vanished life. People began to visit. Some came out of curiosity, some out of respect, some because their parents or grandparents once lived here and spoke of the flood that forced them out. Those visitors walked the streets where their ancestors had walked. They touched the stones of buildings where weddings were held, where children learned to read, where families gathered after long days in the fields. It wasn't just archaeology. It was personal history, uncovered by drought and sunlight. But this return came with a sobering reminder. St. Thomas exists only when the lake allows it to. In wet years, the water rises and hides the town again. In dry years, it reappears, silent, skeletal, exposed. Its presence is temporary, its disappearance inevitable, its message eternal. A haunting reminder of what was gained and what was lost in the name of progress. Legacy, what St. Thomas teaches us today. St. Thomas is more than a drowned town. It is a reminder, a quiet, enduring reminder of the cost of progress, the fragility of communities, and the stories that refuse to stay buried. Today, when visitors walk among the exposed foundations of St. Thomas, they walk across a timeline. Each stone outlines a life that once unfolded here. Each wall frame hints at routines, struggles, triumphs, and heartbreaks. Every path carved into the earth marks footsteps that have long since vanished. But the most powerful part of St. Thomas isn't what we see. It's what we feel. Here, in this desert valley, surrounded by silence and sun, You sense the weight of choices made nearly a century ago, choices that reshaped the American West, electrified entire states, and demanded the sacrifice of towns like this one. Hoover Dam provided water, power, growth, and possibility to millions of people. It turned Las Vegas into a thriving metropolis. It irrigated farmland across the Southwest. It stabilized a river once known for destruction. But its benefits came with a cost. St. Thomas stands as the physical reminder of that cost. A community uprooted, drowned, forgotten, and then unexpectedly remembered. There's something profoundly human about its reappearance. The town rises from the water not as it once was, but stripped to its essential outline, a bare sketch of lives lived here. It forces us to confront the impermanence of even the most determined human effort. Homes crumble, fields dry, water levels rise and fall, but the story remains. And that is St. Thomas's legacy. A ghost town not lost to fire or abandonment, but to the slow, unstoppable will of a nation determined to move forward. A town erased by necessity, revealed by nature, and preserved by memory. Visitors who stand among its ruins often describe a strange connection, not to the buildings, but to the people who once filled them, people who built a home in the desert, worked the land, raised children, celebrated, mourned, and dreamed. People who left not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And as the drought continues and Lake Mead rises and falls, St. Thomas will continue its quiet cycle, disappearing and returning, disappearing and returning. A ghost town that breathes with the rhythm of the water. A reminder that progress always asks something in return. A place where history sleeps just beneath the surface, waiting for the water to draw back so it could be seen once more. This is St. Thomas, Nevada, the town that drowned and came back,